Good morning. Well, it's good to have the 2 years of COVID-19 lockdowns well and truly in our rear-view mirror, isn't it? At the risk of dredging up unpleasant memories, did you find the first or the second year of lockdowns harder? My impression was that most people found the second year, 2021, harder. At one level, you might think the second year would have been easier, given our experience in handling lockdowns from the year before. But I think people suffered a loss of hope in 2021. We came out of a lockdown in late October 2020 and headed into the summer, hopeful that the restrictions were behind us. But that hope was dashed early in the new year when we headed into a new lockdown in February of 2021, and we went on to become one of the most locked down cities in the world during the pandemic, with 262 days of strict stay-at-home orders. 2021 became the year of languishing, as many people described it, as optimism and hope faded. And the mental health effects have dragged on since the end of the lockdowns, right up to the present. Human beings are wired for hope, and we wither without it. The book of Proverbs teaches hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Hope looks to the promises of a better future, and confident hope rests on trustworthy promises. When I was in my final year of secondary school, I remember the school captain describing me as Mr. Reliable and saying when Charlie says he will do something, he always does it without fail. Well, I wish that were true, but as the years go on, I'm more and more painfully aware of how often I fail to meet commitments that I've made to people. Sometimes small ones, and sometimes even big ones. Martin Luther, the famous reformer, once said, "People try to make me a fixed star, but I am an irregular planet." That is, I cannot be the stable centre for my own life, let alone for other people. Hope does not lie there. Confident hope rests on trustworthy promises, and the good news is that God always keeps his promises. In today's passage, the author of Hebrews reminds us of two promises that God swore on oath to keep. First is the promise God swore to Abraham. We read that promise first in Genesis chapter 12, and it is repeated several times in the book of Genesis, so important is it, including in chapter 22, after the famous story when God tested Abraham's faith by asking him to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice, and then providing a ram as a substitute for Isaac at the last moment. Listen to what happened next. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." The author of Hebrews observes that people swear by someone greater than themselves. There was no one greater for God to swear by, so he swore by himself. God keeps all his promises, unlike us. So why did he swear an oath to keep this one? because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, that is, his promise and his oath, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. The promise to Abraham was a foundational one in God's rescue plan for the whole world, and he wanted to make it very clear to his people that that purpose was fixed. He was not going to change his mind. This was the plan. Not only that, but God wanted us, who have put our hope in his promises, to be greatly encouraged. Our hope is confident because God's promise is trustworthy. The author of Hebrews continues, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. This hope is an anchor for the soul. It is in fact the only anchor that can keep us firm and secure. It can hold us steady and prevent us from drifting away on the tide of life or being wrecked by its storms. What hope are you holding on to? Unless Jesus returns first, we will all die, and we won't be able to take any of what we have achieved or accumulated in this life with us. Naked we came into this world, and naked we will depart, or perhaps dressed in a pine box. Death will dislodge every earthly anchor, and we have no one in heaven but God. There is no lasting hope anywhere else. There is nowhere else to flee for refuge. But in God's unbreakable promise, sworn under oath, we have an eternal hope of life in God's presence. And this hope is bound up with Jesus. It has entered into God's presence, into the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, to use the temple imagery, where Jesus has entered on our behalf as our forerunner to pave the way for us, having become a high priest forever to secure access into God's presence for us. In fact, as we saw in chapter 4, through Jesus, we can approach God's throne of grace with confidence now in our prayers, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Over the next few chapters, the author of Hebrews writes that in comparison with God's Old Testament law in the Mosaic covenant, in Jesus we have a better hope, a better priest, a better covenant, and a better sacrifice. I said in an earlier sermon that you could summarise the whole book of Hebrews with 3 words. Jesus is better. And that is the great point of these next chapters. A better hope, a better priest, a better covenant, a better sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 7 picks up where chapter 6 ends, with Jesus, our better high priest. In fact, you might remember it was back in chapter 5 that we first read about Jesus being designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Now chapter 7 explores that declaration. That brings us to another promise God swore on oath. The promise God swore to Jesus. Listen to these words from Psalm 110, a royal psalm which the New Testament regularly applies to Jesus. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. This promise was also crucial to God's rescue plan for the world. God promised Abraham, through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. And God kept his promise to Abraham by keeping this promise to Jesus. The point of God's oath is again that we might have confident hope. Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. Through Jesus, because of his promise, the promise made by God to him, the better covenant is guaranteed. So what does it mean for Jesus to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek? Melchizedek appears just once in the Bible's story, in Genesis chapter 14, with no backstory and no later appearances. The only other references to him are in Psalm 110 and here in the book of Hebrews. In Genesis 14, Abraham was on his way home after defeating a group of kings, think local warlords, who had kidnapped his nephew Lot. On the way back, he met Melchizedek, who blessed him, and Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of the plunder from his victory over the kings. The author of Hebrews reflects on Melchizedek and sees him as a type or pattern or model that points forward to Jesus. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Well, according to the author of Hebrews, how is Jesus like Melchizedek and unlike the Levitical priests in the Old Testament? The author of Hebrews makes several points in chapter 7. Like Melchizedek, Jesus is a king priest, both ruler and mediator. Like Melchizedek, Jesus is not from the tribe of Levi, from the priestly tribe. Remember, Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. Like Melchizedek, Jesus' priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. Did you notice that as the Levitical priests blessed the people and received a tithe from them, Melchizedek blessed Abraham, the ancestor of the Levites, and received a tithe from him. And by analogy with Melchizedek, whose beginning and end are not recorded, Jesus has a permanent priesthood on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. He died, but he rose again and lives forever. And he is a priest forever. The author of Hebrews drives that point home in chapter 7 from start to finish, again and again. Jesus is high priest forever. Going beyond the comparison with Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews says two other things about Jesus, God's Son, as high priest. First, this high priest is, as we saw, the guarantor of a better covenant, a better agreement for the relationship between God and his people. Second, this high priest offered a better sacrifice than the Levitical priests. He is the sinless high priest who sacrificed for our sins once for all when he offered himself. In coming weeks, we'll hear more about the better covenant and better sacrifice brought through Jesus, our high priest. Today, reflecting on the eternal priesthood of Jesus, Jesus as the better priest, Hebrews chapter 7 answers the question, what is Jesus doing now? We know about his birth and life, his words and works, his death and resurrection, his ascension and his promised return. But what is Jesus doing right now? The New Testament offers several answers to that question. He is, for example, ruling the universe, spreading the gospel through his witnesses, and saving sinners. I want to encourage you this morning with the answer in Hebrews chapter 7. Because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. What is Jesus doing now? He is in the presence of God the Father, speaking to him continually on behalf of all who come to God through him, all who place their hope in God's promises and their trust in God's Son. Are you a Christian? Jesus is speaking to the Father on your behalf now, so that where he is, you may be also. Let me conclude with the opening verse of our next hymn. Before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, who ever lives and pleads for me. My name is graven on his hands. My name is written on his heart. I know that while in heaven he stands, no tongue can bid me thence depart. No tongue can bid me thence depart.